of all, hi, welcome. My name is Bobby Blanchard, and I'm the Senior Director of Audience Development here at Morning Consult. We're here today to talk about ESG initiatives. Now, environmental, social, and governance initiatives, ESG initiatives, these aren't just feel-good bullet points for PR teams. They really have a real impact on people and the planet we live on. Here at Morning Consult, we ran a survey and conducted research to identify consumers' attitudes towards, awareness of, and the actions they take when it comes to brands and the ESG initiatives that brands are taking. Now, consumers think that employees and customers should be at the top of companies' priority list, but there's only a small subset of them that are willing to reward brands that comply with their standards and punish those that don't. My colleagues Claire and Lindsay in this webinar are going to explore what exactly consumers want companies to prioritize, how closely US adults are paying attention to ESG practices, where consumers are getting information on ESG, and how ethics tie into purchasing. Now, this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available after if you want to rewatch it or send it to a colleague. Additionally, we will be taking questions at the end of this webinar. Now, we will take those questions not via the chat function, but via the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen. You should see it right about there in the middle. So if you have any questions, please submit them via that Q&A chat, and we will get to as many as possible at the end. With that, I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to pass things off to Lindsay, who will get us started.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bobby. And hello, everyone who has taken the time to join today. Thank you so much for taking an hour or so out of your day. We are super excited to be sharing this recent research on ESG and corporate ethics with you. I know Bobby did some introductions, but in case some of you joined late, just to reintroduce myself, I'm Lindsay Roschke. I am an analyst on the industry intelligence team here at Morning Consult, mostly covering travel and hospitality, food and beverage, but some kind of larger brand and marketing subjects as well. And I am joined by my very ethical colleague, Claire Tassin. Claire, I'll give you a minute to say a quick hi too, so you don't have to sit in silence while I'm presenting.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name's Claire. I'm also one of the analysts on the team here at Morning Consult. My focus is a little bit more on retail and really shopping behaviors from consumers, but like Lindsay, also get to take a broad view and lift up to look at subjects like this that impact all industries. So Lindsay and I are going to work together on this report and we will be sharing the presentation, but Lindsay's going to kick us off.
Awesome. Thanks, Claire. All right. As I said, what we are going to be sharing today is the culmination of some research and a lot of analysis on the state of ESG, of course, the acronym meaning environmental, social, and governance. One thing that I do want to say before we kick off is that this report is kind of just the start in this area. I think we realized once we got the research back from this survey that there was just a ton to dig into. So also keep an eye out for more memos coming from myself and Claire, kind of digging into different aspects of what we found. But this is a really good kind of jumping off point and overview of what we found in the data. And we were really interested in exploring this topic because, in fact, actually, I think it's interesting. Claire and I both pitched this topic separately, which is how we ended up working on it together. So obviously, if both of us are kind of thinking about it in our own worlds and, came to the team with separate pitches, it's something that we should be paying attention to. And it really does feel like the landscape is truly shifting under our feet right now. We're seeing regulations changing, consumer preferences evolving, sometimes in opposite directions from each other. So we really felt like it was important to get a pulse check on where consumers were at the moment, what they expect of businesses, and how they feel companies are or are not measuring up. So let's take a look at the next slide and just a kind of overview of some of the major themes that we discovered in the research. As Bobby said, at the core, ESG initiatives are important for a couple of different reasons. Like, yes, they feel good, but they also have a real impact on people and the planet. They also have an impact on the bottom line for businesses because many investors consider ESG to be a success metric, and also because many consumers make decisions based on what they know companies are or are not doing and are potentially shopping their values. And so we're really going to focus on the consumer portion of this, not necessarily the investor portion. In order to understand more, we did what we do best. We conducted a survey of over 5,000 US adults in order to really dig into the attitudes and awareness and actions regarding ESG initiatives. And there are really a few key themes that we found that you're going to see play out through the data that Claire and I are about to take you through. So first, there's a real disconnect between consumer expectations and perceived corporate priorities. So consumers expect brands to prioritize people, their customers and employees over all other things. But when we ask what they believe businesses are doing in reality, they tend to say that they have their eyes on profit before people. So that's definitely a challenge. Second, overall awareness of ESG initiatives among consumers is low. So less than half of US adults say they've seen, read, or heard something about ESG initiatives across all categories in the past month. Third, ethics don't necessarily always tie to purchasing. So a plurality of consumers say that they will actually overlook ethical behavior if the product and the price are right, which really shows that kind of tactical, functional purchasing behavior. But that doesn't mean that consumers don't have an impact. More than 1/3 say that if a company acts unethically, they're going to stop buying from them. So we definitely have to pay attention there. And then finally, people issues are the ones that are most likely to actually impact purchase behavior. So when it comes to the ones that really do have an impact on consumer decisions, it's employee treatment, safe working conditions, and wages. Those are the things that really take the lead in consumers' minds. So in this presentation, we're going to have 3 sections that we will cover. Ethics, so in other words, what consumers think companies should be focused on, how they perceive brands to be acting. The second is awareness. So how much do consumers know about what's happening? How do they learn about it? And then third, action. When consumers are aware of those things, what do they do when they think companies are measuring up or not in the realm of ESG? So let's dive in. First, we are going to take a look at company ethics. In other words, what consumers want companies to be doing and how they believe brands are performing against those expectations. Now, one of the key questions that I had coming into this research was how consumers believe companies should be prioritizing their efforts. So what we did was we gave respondents to our survey 6 areas of focus. If you go on to the next slide, you can see what those are. So customers, employees, community, environment, profit, and investors. So we gave them these 6 areas of focus, and we asked the respondents to rank those areas in order of their preferred priority from 1 to 6. So in other words, what should companies in general be focusing on? And then we gave respondents those same 6 areas of focus. We asked them to rank them in order of how they thought companies actually prioritize their efforts. So from there, we created a sort of composite score. We got this overall ranking. So on the left, you see the rank of how companies should prioritize in consumer mindset. And on the right, it's how consumers feel they are prioritizing. So you can see that it's not very even. So let's unpack that a little bit. When we asked what companies should prioritize, you can see that consumers really believe it should be people. So customers, employees, local communities, 1, 2, 3, bam, bam, bam. And you can see that traditional markers of business success really fall to the bottom of that list of priorities. So profit, investor happiness, those are down at the bottom. But like I said, these 2 rankings clearly do not add up. In reality, consumers believe that profit is the #1 priority for companies. And while they do believe that customers come next, which is a good thing, they also think that investors follow just behind, despite believing that they should, in fact, be at the bottom of the priority list. Now, one thing I should note is that this ranking that you see on the screen here is when we asked about companies in general. The perceptions do differ slightly by size of business. So we also ran this same set of questions asking about small businesses and asking about specifically large corporations. And what we found is that the expectations are a little bit different. Small businesses are considered to be more customer-centric. Consumers also have less of an expectation that small businesses prioritize the environment, for example, which is logical given they often have a smaller environmental footprint, and instead want those small businesses to be focused on local communities, which again, really makes sense. They tend to be closer to the community than some of those large corporations. There are also some differences in expectations by demographic. So for example, men say businesses should place a higher priority on profit. Conservatives say businesses should favor investors. And both of these groups put the environment at the bottom of their priority list. On the other hand, liberals and Gen Zers put more emphasis on the environment. They say that should be higher up on the priority list for businesses. And when asked what companies are prioritizing, the greater good, the environment, local communities tend to fall to the bottom of that list for all demographics. So it just shows that, ultimately, despite some demographic differences, businesses are not focusing where consumers want them to, particularly when it comes to people. So if you go on to the next slide, we did dive a little bit deeper here. And while there are some differences by size of business, consumers also understand that businesses in different categories can and should have slightly different priorities. So for major industries, healthcare, food, retail, travel, we asked whether consumers felt like businesses should prioritize people, planet, or profit. And so the first thing that you'll notice here there are a lot of tall pink bars. That represents the share of respondents who said that businesses in these categories should focus on people. So things like customers, employee well-being, safety, local communities. For nearly all categories, consumers think companies should prioritize people, which really further underscores that data that I shared on the previous slide. Now you'll see on the far right, the one exception here is in automotive. So in that category, consumers believe companies should prioritize the environment. I thought this was really fascinating and should be considered a kind of urgent signal that brands in the automotive space should not let up on environmental efforts despite the prospect of loosening government regulations. It really is a priority for consumers. You'll also see that the expectations of the environmental focus are higher in tech categories, both products and services. That's going to continue to be part of the conversation while we talk about the environmental impact of AI, for example. On the other hand, consumers give companies the most permission to prioritize profits in the financial and insurance sector. So some real differences and nuances across categories here. And the biggest gap between expected priorities is in healthcare and in restaurants, where consumers really kind of expect an outsized focus on people. And on the other hand, there's a lot more parity in categories like tech and auto. And so we really think is that this just gives another layer of nuance. Brands across categories should be considering these differences in addition to the overall expectations for companies in general and based on size of company when it comes to strategizing for the current ESG landscape. So I'm going to hand it over to Claire for another look at a kind of different demographic angle.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. So jumping right off of Lindsay's last point here, we also asked our survey respondents to sort of give an overall assessment of their impression of how companies in different industries behave ethically in general. So looking at all of those components together, people, profit, and planet, all in one space, we asked respondents if they believe that companies in these industries are acting ethically, specifically because it's the right thing to do. And as you can see on the chart, we don't all agree about what industries are the most ethical. And there's certainly a lot of disagreement in different consumer cohorts about that assessment of if companies are doing the right thing, of their own volition, essentially. At the top line, on this chart, you'll see the gray circles represent the share of the general population who believe that all or most companies in each industry are behaving ethically because it's the right thing to do. So you see that rank order on the vertical axis of the chart that healthcare wins out in this space. People generally think that healthcare, and you think about how close people are to their healthcare practitioners, that they believe that the healthcare industry is behaving ethically because it's the right thing to do. Food and beverage products, restaurants, so some of those same industries that Lindsay just talked about, where that emphasis is on people in consumers' minds of where they should be focused, also float to the top in the overall assessment of if companies are acting ethically of their own volition. Toward the bottom of the chart, we see the tech industry, automotive, and all the way at the bottom, financial services, where consumers have a much less favorable impression of these industries behaving ethically. Of course, I'm sure we can all just think in the last 2 years and name a couple brands in those industries that have been caught up in some very public scandals where their ethics have been called into question. So I don't think that's terribly surprising, unfortunately. But it's also really worth noting the demographic spread on these charts. So, for example, the triangles that are in different shades of green represent consumers of different income levels, and our highest income consumers, first and foremost, just have less spread between those different industries. They're all sort of in that, high 30s to, 45% range, minus healthcare being out closer to 50% of, again, high income consumers who believe these companies are behaving ethically. And they're far out ahead of everyone else. We also see that men who are represented in the gold sort of diamond shapes are also giving more favorable estimates to company ethics, along with Republicans who are in the red squares. Now, on the flip side of the chart, you see that women who are in the purple diamonds, lower income consumers in the light green triangles, and the blue squares, which represent Democrats, all have less favorable impressions of corporate ethics and if companies are behaving in an ethical manner. So obviously people's lived experiences and sort of standards for what that means are influencing this data. I think on the high income front, a lot of that has to do with a lot of, the high income people are working in corporate offices in a lot of these industries, and they know the folks who are making these decisions and maybe have a bit more favorable impression of the people that are working behind these businesses. On our next slide, we can see what consumers actually mean when it comes to what it means to be an ethical business in each of our categories for analysis. So that environmental category, the social category, and the governance category. So we said, what's important to you in terms of how you determine if a company is environmentally friendly, if they have strong social practices, if they are, running in an ethical manner. And, we know that consumers would like all of our brands to behave ethically all the time, but without sort of a crystal clear rubric of what that means, that's hard for us to gauge. It's also harder for consumers to gauge. So per consumers, in order for a company to be perceived as environmentally friendly, it is very important that in those green bars at the top of the page, that they are worrying about animal habitats and our natural ecosystems, that they are concerned about waste and wastewater treatment practices. Huge conversation in the tech industry with AI data centers right now. And of course, for product businesses that we're sourcing our materials in a sustainable manner. For social, again, it's all about people. It is, are the employees safe? Are they paid a fair wage? Are we thinking about accessibility in a lot of our product lines? And then finally, when it comes to just business ethics more generally, in terms of governance, protecting customers' PII is paramount. I know there's a lot of regulation in this space, but it is something that consistently comes up whenever we survey on it. It always floats to a top of consumer concerns. Of course, that companies are complying with regulations as necessary in their industries, and that in general, they are acting with integrity. On the next page, we can kind of get an assessment of where our consumers see themselves, or see, I should say, American companies versus other companies in the world on some of these initiatives. So all related to these ESG issues, where do Americans believe that US companies fall relative to companies in other countries? So what you're looking at in this chart is, again, the share of our survey respondents who believe that US companies are prioritizing each of these items somewhat or much more than companies in other countries. So you can see in general, US consumers believe that American companies are prioritizing profits and C-suite compensation more than other countries generally, as well as specifically EU and Chinese companies. However, when it comes to things like DEI initiatives, employee well-being, community support, charitable donations, environmental impact, we see that generally we believe that Americans believe that our US companies are prioritizing those initiatives much more than Chinese companies, but a bit less than EU-based companies. So we generally grade ourselves, pretty favorably as compared to companies from China versus a little less favorably as compared to companies in the EU. In terms of what consumers expect from a regulatory perspective, we saw a really mixed response when we asked sort of who's responsible in general for enforcing ESG standards on corporations. And when we asked our respondents sort of, a number of attributes, we're just looking at 3 of them on the page today, if they support or oppose government level regulations on all types of ESG initiatives, we saw pretty predictably massive splits based on political identification from the consumers. So, when we asked about, for example, on that first set of charts, if we should require transparency in environmental reporting, we saw the most support for any type of regulatory initiative that we tested. And I think this one is so resonant with consumers because while a lot of folks tell us that they want to be able to shop with environmental sustainability in mind, that's actually a really hard thing to do, given that there's so much inconsistency in the way that different companies and different industries are reporting on their environmental sustainability credentials, right? Where it's hard to get an apples to apples comparison brand to brand, and that adds a lot of work for consumers. So there's certainly a lot of support and a relatively little disagreement between Democrats and Republicans on this one as well. So consumers would like to see more enforcement of companies making environmental impact reports readily available and easy to read for the public. We, of course, see a bit more divisiveness when it comes to limiting company contributions to PACs and super PACs, as well as requiring diverse representation on corporate boards. So we tested a number of these. If you want to dig into more of that data, that's certainly available. But generally what we found is that, there's a bit more agreement between Democrats and Republicans in terms of limiting companies' ability to donate to PACs. And when it comes to a diversity initiative, though, on boards, that is one that there is far more disagreement about on a political scale. When it comes to, though, how we're actually communicating all of these initiatives, I mentioned how that's hard, especially for those environmental initiatives. How we're getting this information to consumers, Lindsay's going to take us through the next section of this report.
Yes, thank you, Claire. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how consumers learn about ESG programs and initiatives. And I think, something to keep in mind and something that I'm sure a lot of you on the line have kind of talked about or maybe even struggled with is that when you do get some effort in place, some initiative in place from an ESG perspective, you do want to tell people about it, right? But there is a kind of fraught landscape because efforts have become very politically polarized in recent years. It also requires a bit of a delicate balancing act. You have to be able to communicate your effort to investors, to consumers, but also not make it look like publicity was the main motivation for doing it in the first place. You want to show that you're doing it for the right reasons. So kind of how do you walk that line? Where are people finding out information? That's what I'm going to dig into. So looking at that next slide, we know now that consumers have pretty high expectations when it comes to corporate responsibility. So I think given that, it's really logical to see that most people report paying at least some attention to what businesses are doing on multiple fronts behind the scenes. So the way that we've lined up this data is that the kind of on a scale of 0 to 6, we asked people how much attention they pay to all of these different facets of what businesses are doing. And 0 was none, 6 was a lot, and 4 was some. So if we kind of line up all of those at the 4 and see how many people are paying at least some attention, if not more, you can see that it's a pretty significant number of people. So nearly 1/4 of consumers, 23%, say they pay a lot of attention to whether or not companies are doing right by their customers, but nearly 7 in 10 say they pay at least some attention. And this is really, further support of shoppers' expectations of that customer centricity, the people centricity. And then the other areas issues that command the most consumer attention are things like whether or not company leadership is acting ethically, how companies are treating their employees, how they're interacting with small businesses. So really kind of different aspects of just almost acting like a human as a business. But one thing I do want to call out here too is it's worth noting that even the elements that fall a little bit lower on that list, so things like environmental efforts and charitable contributions, they still garner at least some level of attention from more than half of consumers. So this is really showing us, people are paying attention to what's happening. But that leads to a very important question, which is how do they find out if they are paying attention? Like, how do they get that information? Where are they learning about these initiatives? So if we take a look at the next slide, you can see this is where a really interesting disconnect comes up. Consumers say they're paying attention, but overall awareness of specific ESG initiatives is still low. Less than half of US adults said that they have seen, read, or heard about ESG initiatives in the past month across all of these major consumer categories. So that's what you're seeing represented on the chart here. The share of consumers who said that they saw, read, or heard something in the past month. Environmental activity is in that teal, social is in pink, and governance is in blue. There are a couple of things to point out here. We were sort of interested in pulling apart the E, S, and G to understand if there was kind of more awareness in some areas than others. Overall, consumers are most likely to have heard about governance issues across or initiatives across categories. That's particularly true in the healthcare space. More than 2 in 5 people said that they had seen, read, or heard something about that in the past month in healthcare. On the flip side, environmental initiatives have the lowest awareness level. Again, you see auto brands buck the trend here, as consumers are most likely to have heard about environmental efforts in this category, which really does align with that, overall preference that I talked about earlier for brands in the automotive space to be really focusing on and prioritizing environmental and sustainability initiatives. What I also think is interesting is that we followed up these questions with open-ended ones. So we asked the respondents who did say that they had seen, read, or heard something in the past month. We asked what brand that they had heard from, what brand was associated with the news or the initiative that you were aware of. And these open-ended responses really yielded mostly mentions of the biggest brand names. We saw a lot of Googles, Apples, Amazons, Nikes. And so this really suggests that smaller companies are still struggling to break through and stand out when it comes to their ESG messaging, and that it still is the bigger names that are resonating with consumers. Moving on to the next slide. So with awareness relatively low, we also thought it would be helpful to examine which channels are actually effective in disseminating ESG messaging to consumers. So those who had seen, read, or heard something about an ESG initiative in the past month were perhaps unsurprisingly most likely to have done so through social media. But what I think is really interesting here is that the content types on social, there really is not a lot of differentiation between them. So ads, sponsored posts, posts directly on a company's account, influencer content, they're all pretty similar in terms of the share of people that said that that was the type of content that alerted them to the initiative. And what this really suggests is that consumers are not delineating between the types of content when it comes to learning about ESG efforts on social media. They're scrolling through their feed, they're seeing something about it, but they're not really kind of clocking where it's coming from or who it's coming from. Because I can't imagine that these things are being communicated exactly equally through all of these different types of content. So it really is, there's a very little differentiation there, which I think is kind of fascinating. There's also very little difference between the channels people are using to learn about those 3 different types of ESG initiatives. So for example, they're learning about environmental issues on generally the same platforms and places as social programs, as governance initiatives. The one thing that I really want to draw your attention to on this slide is the fact that brand-owned media channels, so things like direct newsletters, store signage, packaging, they're comparatively low in terms of sources of information. And this really suggests that consumers are not often seeking out information proactively from a brand, and that they're more likely to come across it when engaging with various media types for other purposes, for their own purposes, whether that's entertainment or news or social interaction. To that end, word of mouth and traditional media were both more commonly cited as a source of information than brand-owned media as well. As is true for many things ESG, and as we've kind of talked about on several previous slides, consumers do vary across demographics in terms of where they've learned about these initiatives. So, for example, younger consumers are more likely to have learned about these initiatives through social media, probably not a huge surprise. Older consumers are more likely to cite traditional media. But then we found some nuances as well, like Gen Zers are more likely than other generations to say they found out from packaging, which I found to be quite interesting. So the Gen Zers are paying attention to what's printed on the packaging. And the generational differences extend, not only to how consumers have heard about ESG efforts, but also how they want to hear about it. So if we go to that next slide, you can see a slightly different take on that previous question, which is not where did you hear about an ESG initiative, but where do you want to learn about ESG initiatives? And overall, despite having mostly heard about efforts through social media, we found that doesn't necessarily mean it's where consumers want to get that information. And in reality, we found that they would most like to learn about a company's ESG efforts from the brand's website. And this is interesting. It presents a bit of a conundrum because it requires consumers to actively go and visit a brand website, which they may do, but it's a lot less likely that they're going to do that than that they're going to be scrolling social media and kind of come across the information reactively. That said, what I think this does speak to is a desire for more detailed information about ESG efforts. And that's the type of information that can more likely be presented successfully on a website than on a short social media post with a character limit. And it does raise opportunities for brands to sort of funnel interested consumers to their website for deeper engagement and more information where possible. So again, and going back to some of that stuff Claire talked about, communicating your efforts in a kind of clear, engaging, understandable, but also detailed way is really important. Now, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we do see some real generational differences on this subject, particularly when it comes to communication via social channels. So half of Gen Zers, 50%, and 46% of millennials say they prefer to learn about these ESG efforts via social media. Only 35% of Gen Xers and 21% of baby boomers say the same. So that's a huge difference there between generations in terms of what their preferences are. And one other thing that I want to call out here is that while many brands leverage their direct communications with consumers, so like email, newsletters, and things like that to share information about corporate initiatives, that approach is among the least preferred by all generations, which really suggests that companies should utilize other channels to disseminate this type of messaging. I think, a lot of the work that we've done, and especially Claire has done in the past, shows us that, people want a what's in it for me when it comes to the emails and the newsletters. And, they want their coupons and information about sales and things like that, rather than, brand information about ESG efforts. Another thing I want to call out here is that generational differences are not the only demographic consideration that we have to be aware of when it comes to these information preferences. In general, higher earning consumers are more likely to want this communication digitally. So website, social media, email. Middle and lower income consumers are more likely to prefer kind of traditional methods of communication like television ads, physical store signage. And across the board, low earners are less likely than others to classify any particular channel as a preference. Now, that is likely due to slightly lower interest and engagement with what brands are doing in the ESG space in the first place. Lower income consumers are less likely than middle and high earners to say they pay close attention to brand actions, anything ranging from environmental programs to worker treatment and ethical partnerships. And they're also less likely to say that they've seen, read, or heard about corporate initiatives recently. But that doesn't mean that we should be ignoring this consumer group when it comes to ESG communication. More than 1 in 5 said that they had avoided purchasing with a company in the past year because of ESG issues. And 20% specifically supported a company that was aligned with their ethical stances. So the kind of engagement with information might be a little bit lower, but there is still a real interest in shopping their values. For lower income consumers, their purchase priorities may often be more functional than emotional. But if we're able to kind of find them through their preferred ESG channels, it might help to raise awareness of brand efforts and really encourage engagement. But really, no matter the channel, brands have to consider consumer expectations of priorities when they're crafting messaging around ESG initiatives. And so a combination of that nuance plus the differences in the preferred method of communication and exposure to those different channels can really inform a consumer and channel specific strategy for ESG messaging. So now that we have talked about the ethics, we've talked about the awareness. So we know what consumers expect of companies, we know how they want to find out about it. I'm going to turn it back to Claire to talk a little bit more about what consumers do in response to corporate ESG initiatives.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. I feel like we've covered a strong sense of like what consumers' expectations are, how they want to get that information. Now we're going to look at what they actually do when they have that information and how they respond to brands beyond just their sentiment about those brands. Are they actually changing their purchasing behavior? And the answer is sometimes. And if you look at the next page, we see that consumers do generally believe that they are powerful and influential in driving brands to make decisions with their preferred ethics in mind. So what you're looking at on this chart is the share of respondents who believe that each of these entities are effective or ineffective in pressuring companies to act ethically. So the darker green side of the bar are folks who think, or the share of people who said that each entity is effective in driving companies or pressuring companies to act ethically. And you can see that consumers rank at the top of that. So effectively, people see their own buying power as extraordinarily powerful in driving companies to behave well and are only just a little bit ahead of investors in that line of being able to apply pressure. I think it's interesting that consumers see themselves and investors ahead of regulatory bodies in state and federal government to drive companies. And a bit depressing is that employees fell to the bottom of this chart. So consumers see employees as having the least power to pressure businesses to behave ethically, even when they can do so from inside the walls of that company. And this is really consistent with what we saw in our State of Workers report that was published earlier this year, where we found that a lot of employees right now are just feeling very uncertain about the impact of our current political climate on their jobs. So we see a lot of job hugging behavior and are kind of unwilling to rock the boat and apply pressure internally as a result of that. On the flip side, though, we do see that people say that they want to and they feel like they can vote with their wallets. And we typically see that since we see that, high income and highly educated consumers are the ones who feel most that way, that they're most likely to say that, yes, consumers have a lot of power in these in pressuring companies. So they do feel like they can effectively, wage the power of their wallets against companies if they see them getting out of line. We know that in the extreme sense that, once in a while, a consumer boycott really does make a dent in a brand's metrics. We saw that 1 in 4 consumers, or about 24% of consumers in the survey, said that they had boycotted a company specifically for ESG reasons. And a similar share, 26%, said that they have spent money with a company because of those ESG positions. And again, so you could call that a boycott. And again, we see that really coming from high income, but also young adults who are more likely to intentionally spend money with a company because of their ethical credibility. On the next slide, though, we put a bit of a finer point on the question. We say, well, there's a lot of other components that go into this. Price is certainly one of them. So we forced our survey respondents to make a choice. We said, we give them a binary decision, and you're looking at the shares of consumers in our survey on this page who said 1 in the red bars. If I know a company acts irresponsibly or unethically, I rarely, if ever, overlook those issues and I will stop buying from them. So the red bars are the folks who are really trying to enforce their values on the companies that they purchase from. On the green side, these are the shoppers who will give you a little bit more leeway, where they say, I prefer corporations act responsibly and ethically, but if a company offers a product I like at the right price, I am likely to overlook some of those social issues. And you can see it's a little more than a third of the general population falls on either side of this, but there's a slight edge toward the share who say that they are willing to overlook some ethical issues if the right product is at the right price. That said, there are some groups that are more likely to leverage that purchasing power than others. Gen Zers, of course, are proving to be, living up to that reputation as consumer activists. They are the only group who is more likely to say that they would withhold a purchase for ethical reasons than those who would just power through and make the purchase anyway. We also saw a little bit of that from low earners, but it was still within the margin of error on the survey. But of course, having less budgetary flexibility makes that a bit harder to be able to waive some of those issues. But keep an eye on where high income folks fall on this chart as well, that they are also willing to overlook some mild transgressions if it means getting the right product at the right price. So there's a lot of dissonance that comes into that whenever we talk about Gen Z and corporate ethics. People say, well, what about Shein, right? And we know that Gen Zers are also big, just high volume consumers in general. And I think that it's important to remember that multiple things can be true at the same time, that younger generations would love to see companies acting more ethically, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily believe that they themselves are the ones who are going to hold companies to account in every single purchase that they make. And when we got into this in finer points on the next slide, this is where we really dialed up the analysis, and we ran a maximum difference, or a MaxDiff analysis, on understanding how components like price and other sort of table stakes issues weigh against ESG issues, in understanding the relative importance of all of these different priorities that consumers can hold in their mind at any given time when they are deciding which company to make a purchase from. So before you even look at this chart, we ran this across 5 different industries. We're going to look at 2 of them in detail right now, but you can see those 5 at the top of the page. So we've got airlines in the teal circles, big box retailers in the red squares, packaged food companies in the gold triangles, tech service providers in the purple diamonds, and medical nonprofits in the green hexagons. And what we see is that, well, let me break down the analysis first, what a MaxDiff is, because not everyone on the webinar, I'm sure, is really familiar with this methodology. But essentially, it forces consumers to say, what is sort of your preferred, out of a range of scenarios where we combine a lot of different variables together, what are the sort of most and least important attributes to a purchase decision? So all of that gets boiled together, and we get scores that are scaled around 100. So a score of 100 indicates that that factor has effectively the average likelihood of being considered the most important factor to purchase from, or in the case of our nonprofits, donate to, for any given respondent. A score of 200 would indicate that that factor is twice as likely as average to, again, to be considered the most important attribute. And then a score of 50 is it's half as likely to be considered the most important attribute in making a purchase. So hope you're still following along with all of that data. But what you really need to understand is that from all that analysis, we can see that social issues, again, those people issues that have been floating to the top throughout the presentation, continue to do so here. It's important to note, though, that I had to remove price and a couple other features from this chart because it made the chart unreadable because the scale had to get so large. So we'll take a look at how that all falls out on the next pages, but just within the ESG factors, not quite yet, Bobby, we could flip back, just within the ESG factors, thank you. Bobby's saying wrap it up, it's too complex analysis. Just within those ESG factors, you can see that the clusters of those attributes, those purchase or donation decision factors, really coalesced around the social issues. In terms of governance, that also fell pretty close to the bottom in terms of things like executive compensation or board diversity, not super important to consumers, but saying a company acts ethically and with integrity is of paramount importance, especially for medical nonprofits. And environment, unfortunately, falls to the bottom. We know a lot of the way that we feel like we can be most relevant with consumers. We know consumers are really worried about environmental issues. But again, this is sort of when you force these choices and force these comparisons, those social issues were more important in consumer decision making than some of those environmental issues. And again, we're just looking at this at a general population level. When we go to the next page, we can break all of this down by industry. Now, I am not going to have all of us together look at 5 different heat maps. I will spare you that. They are all available for download on Morning Consult Pro. So if you'd like to see the rest of them, please go ahead and give that report a download. But I pulled 2 examples. So I mentioned, we couldn't include all of the data on that previous page chart because the scale of what I've termed essentials at the top of this heat map is just so far out and to the right as compared to the ESG initiatives that it just doesn't make sense to put them on the same chart because it becomes unreadable. So affordable products and services is the absolute most important thing when it comes to both big box retail decisions, as we're looking at on this page, as well as really every other industry that we examined when it comes to determining what is most important. That was essentially 4x as important as the sort of average most important score. So wildly important to be affordable. High quality products and protecting consumers' PII also absolutely important. There were some pretty big differences between Democrats and Republicans in this analysis as well. You can see, for example, that in that governance section on this chart, that Republicans put far more of a priority on shopping from brands that are committed to selling products that are made in the US. With our current tariff conversation, it's not surprising that that is important, but that's something that we generally see Republicans being more sensitive to all the time in general whenever we survey on it, versus Democrats are a little bit more attuned to ensuring that workers are paid a fair wage. Definitely falls in line with our political alignments. But again, it's important to understand that every consumer is going to have a different rubric for how they're evaluating corporate ethics in their decision making. On the next page, this is the last one, guys. We also see that technology service providers have a sort of different set of considerations because, we're not just talking about selling sweaters here. Protecting PII, absolute number one issue when it comes to tech service providers. And when you think about all the conversations we're having now about large language models and where our information is going and who's keeping all of our information safe, that's certainly something that, again, consumers are extraordinarily sensitive to. A lot of these products are free, so the affordability concern was more muted as compared to other industries, but when they are something that we're charging for, affordability is, of course, still a top line concern for consumers. But really the takeaway here is that while we want to do the right thing when it comes to all of our, social, environmental governance issues, price is still going to be one of the most important factors, and just getting those table stakes, treating our customers well component is also going to be one of those major purchase drivers. A lot of the issues that we're talking about today ultimately are secondary when it comes to that purchase consideration, but that's not to say that they're not important for brand reputation and, again, being a place that other people want to work as well. So don't take this to mean that we can ignore everything that we just said. I just think it's important to contextualize this in the gamut of things like price when it comes to consumer decision making. I know we've got a ton of questions flowing in. I've been keeping an eye on that. I know Bobby has as well, so I'm going to pass it back to him. I'm going to take a sip of water, and we are going to start getting into some of your questions.
Well, thank you, Claire and Lindsay, so much for that presentation. That was so great. I was telling Claire and Lindsay before this webinar started, actually, that this is one of my favorite reports we published this year because there is really data on just pretty much every industry imaginable in this report. So I'm really going to encourage you all to go find it on Morning Consult Pro and download it yourself. In fact, I'm going to do even more than that. I'm going to show you what you can find at a Morning Consult Pro really quick while I give Claire and Lindsay a trick second to get a sip of water and read through some of those questions that have come in and get ready to answer them. So I'm going to share my screen real quick here um, and kind of talk through where you can find this stuff. So, all of that analysis you just saw came from a report that we published in Morning Consult Pro, which is you can find on pro.morningconsult.com. When you log in, this will be our homepage. You can navigate over to our report library via this nav bar on the left side of your screen, and you can find the report right here on the main page. You click this download button and it downloads, you get the full report, a lot more data in here that we didn't get a chance to touch on in this webinar. So I really encourage you to check it out. We publish a lot on brand data and consumer trends in Morning Consult Pro, and all of that analysis that we publish is powered by several different Morning Consult research offerings, including both custom research and custom surveys like this report, and a proprietary data platform called Morning Consult Intelligence. Now, Morning Consult Intelligence has daily data on key audiences and offers granular insights and reliable trends on thousands of brands. This platform is available to Morning Consult clients. If you don't have Morning Consult Intelligence but would like to learn more, please reach out to our team at pro@morningconsult.com, and we'd be happy to get in touch with you to give you more information. Now, with that little spiel done and completed, I'm hoping Claire and Lindsay have chugged a good glass of water or so and feel ready to rock and roll. Let's dive into some questions. First, I need to issue a correction. I'm a former journalist, so I believe strongly in corrections. Julie, you asked in the chat if we had any data on nonprofits. I said no, that was wrong. We do have data on nonprofits in this report. Like Claire said towards the end of that presentation, we actually asked about medical nonprofits. So I'm going to pull up that slide right now from the full report and let Claire speak on it in a second.
Awesome. Thanks, Bobby. Yep, it's the last one. Perfect. So I wanted to include nonprofits in this and we reframe the question rather than a purchasing decision as a donation decision to understand what is really important to donors. I think a lot of this can be extrapolated to any type of nonprofit, but just for this type of analysis, we wanted the specificity of being to hone in on a specific type of nonprofit. The first and most important sort of driver of decision-making and donation decision-making was having a strong record of producing real results. So Lindsay alluded to this earlier, but people need that with them, the what's in it for me. Like, what are you actually doing? Where are my dollars actually going? I would equate this to like the product quality when we were looking at the retail data a couple minutes ago. The other component that was, again, pretty important across the board for all industries was they act ethically and with integrity. That was even more important in the nonprofit slide. If you remember, that one was like kind of off to the right of that dot plot that we looked at a couple of minutes ago. And then supporting a condition that affects me or a loved one, it's just sort of a sense of, is this relevant to me? People are, of course, going to donate to issues that are closer to their hearts. So that is what's underpinning that decision. So those were some of the factors, again, and hopefully you've grabbed a screenshot of this chart that we were examining and how the sort of relative importance of all these different features were falling out specifically for nonprofits. But again, a lot of these table stakes issues were consistent across industries. That safe working conditions for employees is certainly an important one. Fair wages, a tough thing in the nonprofit industry, also important. So you're not necessarily off the hook for sort of the more general ESG initiative just because you've got one cause, really front and center in your business.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Cleo, another question I'm going to throw your way. We got a question about DEI from our audience. Specifically, within DEI, did you get any reads on shifting consumer sentiments, on companies divesting or dismantling programs aimed at engaging multicultural or more underrepresented audiences? And I believe you did a report on this just earlier this year, actually.
Yeah, pretty recently. This has clearly been a topic that I've been paying a lot of attention to. So there's a report on the site. I would encourage you to download it. I kind of looked at the inverse of your question, though. I looked at the companies that are sticking with DEI, and I used our MCI brand tracking to just pull a selection of brands and kind of lump them together to look at any overarching trends in brands that are sort of sticking firmly to their values. And the top line from that report was that consumers are certainly not punishing companies for sticking with DEI, but they're not necessarily rewarding them either. So there's obviously a huge political divide in this conversation. We saw a lot of that in this report, and we saw just as much of that in the DEI report. But what I thought was so interesting in the DEI report was that when I looked at brand purchasing consideration and all types of brand sentiment, Republicans' sentiment and purchasing consideration for brands that are choosing to stick to their DEI policies has been increasing within the Trump administration, right? I can explain that in a second. Democrats, though, are not necessarily seeing that same upward trend, which again, little weird, but makes sense when you look at there's just been an overall consumer sentiment upswing from Republicans ever since last November in the election that's driving just kind of a more general positive brand sentiment trend across the board. But it's clear that while there's a lot of sort of top line opinion about DEI from consumers based on what they're seeing in the headlines, that is very rarely translating to meaningful impact on individual brands. Obviously, there's exceptions to every rule. Some brands have been more in the spotlight than others. But generally, what we're seeing is that for brands that have just sort of been consistent saying these have been our values, these will continue to be our values, they're not being punished, but also not necessarily being rewarded by the folks who you think would be rewarding them. Anyway, download the report. Happy to talk more about it.
Awesome. Yeah, we could. We actually did do a whole webinar about this, right? Or we could
Yeah.
theoretically. Yeah, like this. This is a report that we've gotten a lot of questions about and a lot of interest in as well. Lindsay, I'm gonna take two questions and marry them together and pass them your way. We have one question, about presumably some consumers who are more aware of ESG issues than others. Who are they? But similarly, we also got a question about one of the slides we had. I'm going to pull it up real quick here. Let me show my screen again. Thank you all for playing screen musical chairs with me. Yes, this slide right here. Somebody asked on this slide, these percentages don't add up to 100%. What are the other options here for these readers, or these consumers, I mean?
Yeah, so yeah, I think those two things go together really well. There are a couple of different ways that you could sort of parse the question, who is more aware of or cognizant of ESG efforts. One of the ways that you could think about it is whether or not they've seen, read, or heard about efforts in the past month. But another way I think is related to this question and the share of respondents who are left out of this chart. And the respondents that are not represented here are those that answered the option, I don't really research or look for companies' ethical stances before making a purchase, and it wouldn't make a difference in my purchase decisions. So that's in tiny, tiny writing at the bottom there of the slide, in case you're looking at the report or taking a screenshot of it. And basically what that's saying is the people on the screen are the ones for whom ESG is making a difference one way or the other. They're at least thinking about it. The other folks who aren't represented are the ones that are not really taking it into account when they're making a purchase. And so I would argue that those consumer groups are the ones that are sort of less cognizant of. It might not mean that they're not aware of them, but that they're not taking it into account when they're making a purchase. And those are probably who you would expect them to be. So younger consumers tend to be more likely to be taking those things into consideration, whether they're overlooking a company acting irresponsibly or not. They're thinking about it when they're making a purchase. Where Gen Xers, baby boomers tend to be more likely to say, I don't really think about these things. In fact, millennials are the generation that's most likely to be considering it one way or the other. The other kind of demographic group that shows a big difference, and Claire and I both sort of touched on this separately, is income groups. So lower income consumers just tend to say that they don't really think about it, which again makes sense. Less expendable income, more kind of functional shopping choices mean that you can't really be thinking about those things. So one way to look at it, but you can also kind of go back and look at the seen, read, heard question to look at it from more of an awareness perspective. And I know we're at time. I'll stop there.
Oh, wow. Thank you for flagging that. I would have kept going for 10 more minutes. I didn't realize we were out of time. I think we're out of time, so we're going to call it there. I don't want to take up more time than we asked for y'all today. But thank y'all so much for taking the time to join our webinar and talk about various our research that we've done on this topic. Really important to us and really important to a lot of our readers, I know. Again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to sign off now and wish y'all a happy Tuesday. We did record this and we will be sending out a recording and a link to the deck as well. But thanks so much, everybody, and happy Tuesday.